September webinar talking about developing an OT cybersecurity strategy. For those of you who may have attended prior ones of our webinars, we're kind of taking a step back here as we, from individual functional topics to talk more broadly about the strategy. And the reason for that is we're finding more and more organizations that we talk to who are partway down the road, but actually haven't done the beginning yet, i.e. establishing a strategy. And maybe it's just part of my background, having been a consultant for 20 years. Having that strategy in place is pretty critical to being able to then go execute appropriately the individual functional elements of the overall strategy. So we wanted to take a step back today to try to sort of lay out how do we see success in building that strategy. Just by way of introduction, for those who may not have been in our webinars before, I'm John Livingston. I'm the CEO of Verve. I spent about 21 or 2 years at McKinsey & Company, which is a global management consulting firm. Did a lot of work helping organizations, industrial organizations in large part, manage their sort of technical and digital transformations. Spent a lot of time in the wireless sector, helping clients with sort of transitioning to wireless, et cetera. And I've been with Verve for about 5 years or so. Verve itself has been around for almost 30 years now, focused on improving reliability and security of industrial processes. So we got our start as a control system engineering firm, so actually designing control systems for power plants and refineries and steel and other manufacturing. And then about 15 years ago, we developed what we call the Verve Security Center, which is a platform that tries to bring all of the elements of OT security together into an integrated platform. And then finally, we also offer a range of services, both strategic services like we're going to talk about today, but also specific security functional services, everything from helping clients with improving their backup postures, doing network segmentation, as well as overall security management and MDR. So that's who we are. We're not really going to spend a lot of time talking about Verve and its products or solutions today. Most of the time is going to be taking that step back to really help you and others who will watch this down the road understand how we think about setting that strategy and what we've seen clients who have been successful in that and what we've seen them do. So just by way of setup, we can't do a discussion around OT security without a little bit of what's been going on out there. I think just yesterday, we had a ransomware attack of a large agricultural organization in the United States. And these are happening more and more. So if you look back over time, over the last sort of 20 years or so, there have been events, whether it be the Merck and Maersk events around NotPetya and WannaCry, the Mirai botnet, the Norsk Hydro, et cetera. There have been significant events, but if you just look in the past year, it's been a literal explosion of the number of attacks that have targeted the OT sector. And when you look at the actual statistics, OT is now, or ICS, is now directly in the crosshairs. Or maybe better phrase, industrial organizations are in the crosshairs. Because in many cases, these aren't actually specifically OT targeted attacks. In many cases, they are attacks targeted in IT, but because of a lack of strategic awareness and planning, they immediately impact OT because it's difficult for organizations to know how far that IT attack can spread, or alternatively, where their OT systems are dependent on IT to keep operating, like billing and other types of things. But in short, manufacturing and energy have become the number 2 and number 3 most targeted industries during 2020. This is data from IBM, from 8th and 9th, respectively. And in large part, this is the outgrowth of an increase in ransomware and other commercially oriented attacks. So if we think about, and I think the SANS survey does well in describing this. If you haven't looked at the 2021 one, I encourage you to do that. If you look over 2017, 2019, 2021, we've seen a massive shift in what organizations are worried about, where those attacks are coming from. And commercially oriented attacks have risen up by far to number one from well down the list in the past. And that ability for hackers to realize I can actually make money, and very good money, by targeting industrial organizations is making our industries much more a focus for risk. So what's therefore kind of happening, and where do we see this evolving? To do any strategy, we have to understand the situation that we find ourselves in, the industry context, as it were. We can't have a strategy without knowing industry context. And so this is our way of describing, in an acronym, what's the industry context right now? Well, first of all, as I mentioned, ICS is becoming a greater target for commercial hackers, the A in our air raid that's going on right now. Number two, IT. IT is becoming a significant driver of decisions and trying to push toward more consolidation of tools, reporting, even metrics, and at the end of the day, the strategy. Regulation. So the first R is regulation. There is increasing compliance pressure. If we go back 15 years, we had the introduction of NERC-CIP here in the United States, which was really the first ICS OT-oriented compliance regulation. We now have them all over the world, and they are becoming much more prescriptive. If we look at the recent United States version of this, which is the TSA pipeline requirements, if we look at some of the things that are going on in Latin America, where they're actually just bringing NERC-CIP directly into their power industries. If we look at what's happening in the Middle East, all of these are becoming more what we're referring to as NERC-light, meaning they are becoming auditable and measurable standards where there's a set of prescriptive actions that organizations are going to need to take. That's going to change the way we have to think about strategy. The second R is resource constraints. Any strategy has to deal with the fact that we're having an explosion in the number of vulnerabilities and threats with no increase, or frankly, maybe even decreases in staff, particularly staff who understand control systems, because more and more of them are frankly retiring every year. We've got alert fatigue. So any strategy has to deal with the fact that the detections are exploding, right? We put in these network monitoring tools or an IDS, and it's flooding us. And so how do we deal with that fatigue? And we can't just have the answer be, well, every time we see an alert, we shut down. That is not an appropriate response to most of these alerts. The second I here is insurers. One of the things that we're seeing more and more from talking with our clients is the quote unquote hardening of the cybersecurity insurance market, meaning it's becoming more difficult to get insurance. The prices are rising. Is that the ICS or OT areas are now becoming a focus for those insurers. They want to see the same level of security in OT as they've historically seen in IT to be able to write that insurance policy. Again, that's going to change the way we think about our strategy, about how we protect these things, because we're going to have to be able to demonstrate certain activities that we're doing to be able to insure. And then finally, the D, which is directors. Directors are becoming a significant force in driving behaviors in OT. In many cases, directors have been fed what are the risks in our organization, and a lot of that has led to IT security focuses. Directors are now realizing that their largest threats, frankly, their largest financial impact could come out of their OT side. And so they're coming to ask, okay, so where's my measurable impact and my measurable improvement on my security in my OT space? And so these are the factors, air raid, that we look at and we say, this environment under which we have to set our strategy is changing. And it's changing pretty rapidly. Literally in the last 2 years, these things are pretty rapidly changing. And therefore, as we set our strategy, if we had a strategy before, probably time to revisit it. If we didn't have a strategy, we better get one. Because these are going to require a set of actions that may have not been quote unquote required before. And so these drive a new set of questions that the boards, insurers, regulators, and everybody's asking. They want to start with what's our baseline security? In other words, how at risk are we? They want to understand what's most critical to protect. They want to understand, are we making progress in becoming more secure? Can we track a continuous improvement program so that we can justify increased investment in such a program? If all we're doing is monitoring and there's alerts going off, how do I know if I'm getting any better or not? Can we demonstrate to both internal and external parties that we're taking some of these security actions that are part of the overall strategy? And I can go down, but the point is that there's a set of questions that are emerging, all of which are fundamentally strategic questions, right? There are things that get to the fundamentals of why are we doing this, right? So great, we're going to go do segmentation. Why? What is the ultimate objective of what we're trying to do here? If we're going to go try and patch, why are we trying to patch? What's the fundamental? It can't just be because we don't want any vulnerabilities. There's something about we are trying to protect certain systems from certain threats. Therefore, we need to focus on these types of actions. And so as we think about, therefore, what are going to be the requirements for any strategy, those requirements are going to start with demonstrating progress in risk reduction, right? So not just being able to say where I am, but demonstrate that I'm going from red to green, as it were. It's more than just inventory, more than visibility. It's actually seeing that I'm in a certain state yesterday and I'm getting better every day. And those results most likely need to be quote unquote auditable, meaning I need a track record of what I did, because insurers, regulators, the board is going to want to know that those actions were taken. And then on the detection side, so the first is risk reduction. The second is threat response, right? So moving from just detection or just alerts to accelerated response. And so the strategy has to involve bringing in multiple forms of telemetry and information to be able to improve the detection, to, instead of just being a bunch of red lights, actually what's really going on. And it needs to be able to respond and react. The strategy has to get to doing something to stop the threat. And again, that can't just be, well, just shut it down. There has to be a set of least disruptive responses that we can take. And then finally, that strategy has to drive increased efficiency. What we call think global, act local, which we'll talk more about as we go here today. But basically the notion of centralizing analytics and then distributing actions so that they can be in control of local OT personnel, so that we don't trip plants in the process of trying to be secure. So these are some of the things that drive the design of our strategy. And so as we then take a step back and say, okay, so what are the steps? What are the key things that one would do to establish a strategy and then make it successful? So the first is aligning the right leadership. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. How do we bring the right group of people together to set such a strategy? Number two, establishing some form of aggressive, clear, and measurable targets. A strategy is nothing unless we know where we're going. What is the ultimate objective we're trying to achieve? That has to start with a target. If we were doing an operational program trying to improve the efficiency of a plant or the safety of the plant, we would have an objective, and we would then lay out a set of steps to achieve said objective. Without an objective, without targets, without being able to measure something, it's very hard to know if we're actually making progress. The third is designing a roadmap. So once we're clear about what those targets are, then laying out a holistic roadmap of how we're going to go from quote unquote red to green. How are we going to achieve those targets? And that roadmap won't just be one thing. There is no silver bullet, so to speak, right? It will be a set of initiatives that we'll need to do in a coordinated way. This is no different than a digital transformation. It's no different than an operational transformation. It's just doing it within the world of security. Then assigning the resources and the budgets. So who's going to be responsible? What kind of skills are we going to need on this team? And what level of budget is going to be required for our level of organization? And then finally, measuring and reporting. Oftentimes, we see that organizations set something up beginning and they make some progress, but then all the tools are separated, or it's manual, or you've got annual assessments with nothing really in between. And so the measurement and the reporting falls by the wayside, and without measurement and reporting, execution doesn't happen. So the last part of a robust strategy is to lay out how are we going to measure and report on how we're doing against that aggressive, clear, and measurable target. So we're going to take some time to walk through each of these steps. a little bit more today, and then answer some questions at the end. So the first is, how do we align the right leadership? And so we'll hit this phrase, think global, act local, a number of times through the presentation. But at the IT OT level, the idea is, okay, how do we leverage IT and what it has in terms of capability, skills, knowledge of security, et cetera, while also leveraging that depth and understanding of the OT personnel on what is critical for the processes to run and operate successfully. And so when we think about it, right, what can we leverage IT for? So what are going to be our security standards? Right? They've been working on this most likely for a long time. What are their standards? What's IT doing on the standards front? How do we adopt those? When we're going to analyze vulnerabilities, right, there's probably a group in IT that have been doing that for years. It does not make sense in our view to say now we're going to have people at every plant trying to analyze what CVE is relevant. Creating remediation strategies. So what's the right balance of patching versus hardening versus backups, whatever? How are we going to best remediate any threats that we have, et cetera? On the OT side, though, there's things that really only control systems folks are going to be able to do effectively. So determine remediation feasibility. So how are we going to be able to patch that system? Or no, because that's a required operating system, we can't reboot it, we can't patch it. Or, boy, we'd really like to have no shared passwords. Right? We'd like to have an individual password for every account and every device. Okay, well, these devices, that probably can't happen. So OT needs to be involved and bring that to the table. Supporting incident response, right? That folks in the plant or operationally oriented are going to be able to understand what we could do from a response point of view much better than folks sitting in IT. The idea is bring these two groups together to jointly solve this problem. Everybody goes, yeah, okay, sure, right, whatever. That's easy to say, hard to do. How do you do that? And so what we have found to be successful in doing that is that, so that's what we'd like to do, bring IT and OT together. But there's challenges, right? There's challenges in the world of OT security. There's challenges with OEM diversity. So each OEM has its own management systems. No ability to centralize views in many cases across OEMs. There's a confusion on risks about actually managing these systems. So there's, some OEMs will tell you, well, you can't do these things because that could cause operational risk. In fact, that's not really true, but no one knows. So there's like a desire to just don't touch it, which is really the next point. Don't mess with it. It's working. Don't mess with it. If you touch it, it may break. The reality is there's a lot of things you can do to secure these things. And there's this fear factor that frankly has been caused in many cases by folks trying to do security things that shouldn't have been done, like scanning with a vulnerability scanner and knocking off line PLCs or patching from 5,000 miles away. But in large part, there are things that we can do, but they have to be adapted to OT. There's resource gaps. There's distributed and legacy systems, right? So we've got network architectures that are complex. We have legacy systems which can't just be patched every Tuesday. And so we have to address those differences. And then finally, we don't really have IT automation tools in OT in many cases. Right? A lot of this stuff right now is done manually. And so there's a pushback on, well, how in the world could we possibly keep up when we don't really have any automated tools? And so how do we therefore bring IT and OT together given this? And so what we found to be successful is first is what we call field and forum. So a lot of this is about sharing knowledge, sharing experiences, and being open with each other. And so that starts with bringing people together into team room, workshop type of things, Zoom calls, whatever. We've had great success with one of our clients, for instance. They did 4 half-day sessions where they brought IT and OT together. And it was essentially a chance for us to tee up the topics and talk a little bit about kind of introduction to OT security and the challenges, et cetera, but it also mostly allowed them to talk to one another about the fears they had, about the challenges that were going on. But then also it involves field. It means getting IT folks out into the plants so they can actually see the real world that happens when you put the steel-toed shoes on and the hard hats. and how difficult many of these systems are. When you look at them on paper, it may look one way, but when you get into that rack and you see the rat's nest of cabling in the back of that rack, how are we going to deal with these kinds of environments? Explaining the whys, right? So a lot of this comes down to why does IT do it one way? Why does OT do it another way? We had a webinar we did several years ago or several months ago about IT is from Mars, OT is from Venus, right? It's almost like we talk different languages, we're from different planets. And so being able to understand why each side does what it does, to build trust. So get to knowing those people in each side rather than just, oh, that's OT. No, that's Joe or that's Cindy or whatever. That allows us to build trust on both sides. Leveraging what we call guides, people who have been there and done this before, who can help explain that. And then finally explaining the operational benefits. So this just isn't about security. There are a significant number of operational benefits that can happen as a result of this. So these are some of the keys that we've seen to enabling the right leadership to come together, a team of people who are both who are IT leaders and OT leaders come together. I'll give you one example. One of our clients has created a security team, senior cybersecurity team, and that team has equal representation at the director and VP level of people who used to be in OT and who used to be in IT or IT security, and they've come together. And so, for instance, the person who is in charge of overall cybersecurity architecture actually used to be, spent 25 years running plants. And that ability to bring those teams together means every conversation has both sides in the room, and it becomes not both sides, it becomes one team trying to achieve a shared objective. So how do we achieve that right IT-OT balance? One example, this is just one case study of a client. They decided to establish the CIS Top 20 as a single standard across IT and OT. What they did is they then brought the IT and OT teams together and they said, okay, there's obviously a set of technical exceptions that we can't do, right? So CIS says you have to have antivirus. Well, you're not going to have antivirus on a PLC. Okay, so let's create a set of technical exceptions that we all agree to. Let's define compensating controls. So if we can't patch every week like we do in IT, okay, well then what is going to be our compensating controls? What's going to be the acceptable controls? And by the way, how do we track them? So if application whitelisting and a firewall are appropriate compensating controls for delaying patching for 2 months or 3 months, okay, how do we track that we've actually got that firewall in place and that we've got application whitelisting and lock control? Establishing timelines. So they set a very rigorous timeline that we're going to be here for everybody by a certain date. That creates a lot of incentive to get done. They created OT-specific policies. They created an OT-IT review board, and then they established a centralized reporting of the subcontrols. That's how they decided to bring IT and OT together. It's not the only way. There's lots of ways. But this is just one example of how organizations have found a way to start to bring the right leadership to the table. So once we have the right leadership, once we have that team of people who are jointly accountable, so to speak, for this, then we need to figure out what's our target. Where are we trying to go in the end of it? What does success look like? So as we think about this, we often fall back to bringing in frameworks, right? There are a lot of benefits to having a framework. We get quicker to decisions. So for instance, we have seen some organizations go 2 or 3 years just trying to define what the objectives are. And they try something and then it goes off and they say, well, we can't really do that. And they're back to sort of redefining the objectives. By having a framework with some guidelines, those decisions become much clearer because it's almost a yes, no. We're going to do that, we're not going to do that. Having clarity of objectives and measurements. Streamlining prioritization, because there could be 1,000 things you could do. But if I go back to that framework and what's required within a framework, I can prioritize things more quickly. If I have a framework, I can then start to compare too, because I can see where I am versus where others are, and am I, making progress relative to some level of standard of peers. And then I can learn from others who have tried to apply that framework and how they've done it. If we look in the world of OT security, the folks are adopting these frameworks, right? So if you look at which ones are most popular, NIST CSF continues to be the most popular framework out there. This is from the SANS survey again. CIS, which was popular, very popular a few years ago, it's declined. It's more kind of average, I'll call it now. ISO, IEC 62443, right, are roughly the same. Around 30% of folks are using those standards. And NERC-CIP, I think this is in large part due to just the growth in people looking at security outside the North American power sector. And so NERC-CIP as a percentage has declined. IEC 62443 continues to gain momentum. And our expectation is over time, those will be combined in many cases with things like NIST CSF to come up with a true OT security standard. But as you go forward, as you think about developing your strategy, we highly encourage the use of some framework. And it may be a combination, right? It may be you have a local or industry regulatory requirement, you may have an overlay. But having a framework starts to give that team a guide of where we're trying to go and what good looks like. The good news is all of these frameworks call for some very similar set of things, right? And there's lots of documents out there that you can see where people have done a mapping of the different frameworks together. And when they do, there's a huge amount of overlap. People call them different things, they put them in different buckets. One's a standard, one's a framework, etc. And obviously each one has its benefits for different things. But it comes down to fundamentals: software and firmware inventories, configuration status, backup statuses, asset criticalities, logging statuses, detection statuses, etc. But eventually, all of these frameworks will ask an organization to start to measure how they're doing against these fundamental things. So given that CSF is the largest framework, we figured we'll kind of use that as our guide for today. We could have done this against CIS or IEC 62443, et cetera. But if we just take a look at NIST, right, there's 5 basic elements. And I don't want to go too much into the weeds of NIST because a lot of people probably know this well. But the point of this chart is to highlight that within that framework, there are a set of elements, kind of like what we talked about on the prior page, where we have to demonstrate action about improving our security to meet the standard. So we need to demonstrate a 360-degree view of the risk in the identify piece. We need to know all the inventory, we need to know the vulnerabilities, et cetera. We need to know the users and accounts, we need to know the backup status. We need to be able to identify the risk. We then need to protect it. That requires actions. It means we have to patch things. It means we have to harden configs. It means we have to deploy AV and anti-malware, et cetera. We need to be able to detect, which means we need to gather that data in a quote-unquote XDR fashion, meaning multiple forms of telemetry, and then monitor and respond, which is the next step to any malicious events. Identify paths. We need to have a plan in place. And then finally, to recover, we absolutely need to be able to take action to quickly recover systems when necessary. But the point here is you could overlay NIST on this, you could overlay IEC 62443 on this. All of those will require taking action to achieve some objective in our target. And so again, the frameworks help us set a target and an objective. Some of those frameworks, so all of the frameworks get down to multiple levels, right, of controls and subcontrols, or in IEC 62443, they're not controls, but they're layers, I think is what it's called. The point is the same, that there are components of each of these. If we take the CIS number 1, for example, which is the inventory of hardware assets, and by the way, this is for CIS 7.1 versus version 8, but the points are generally the same. They allow you to do 2 things. Number 1, target a maturity level, right? So to be able to say, look, we are mature if we have these percentages of our assets discovered, right? So if we're missing less than 6.7% of our assets, we are in a level 2 maturity. And that allows an organization to set an objective within the framework to say, look, we want to be at level 2 across everything. Or we may say, well, for instance, on DHCP, in our ICS environment, we're not using DHCP, so that is going to be an exception. Or for addressing port level access control and unauthorized assets, we may say, look, doing port level access control across all of our OT networking gear is impossible, or would require us to upgrade all of this networking gear, which is too costly. So we say, okay, we're going to take an exception to that, and we're going to find compensating controls. And so we're going to say, if we can get to an alerting function, that will be satisfactory for that. The point is, by going with a framework to think about our targets and our objectives, it gives us a bit of a playbook, right? It gives us a menu to draw from, rather than trying to sit in a room with 20 people and agree on, okay, so what should we do to secure ourselves? Oh, well, we should get inventory and we should do detection. Yes, we should. But these frameworks help us get to that next level of detail to be able to establish targets and metrics. And by the way, I'm going to skip a couple pages here in the interest of time. We'll share the whole document out with everybody. So, okay, so let's say I take that framework and I say, okay, these are the targets that I want to achieve. I'm going to focus on the NIST CSF with IEC 62443 overlaid on top of it. And I'd like to achieve the following set of objectives that I can start to measure against. Okay, so now I got to design a roadmap. So to design a roadmap, I need to think about starting point, ending point, and what am I going to do in the middle? So we've done a lot of these. And as we do them, what we learned is to start with an assessment, but we strongly recommend doing some form of what we call a technology-enabled assessment against whatever standard it is that you pick. A technology-enabled assessment means using technology in the environment to gather data back. So often we see organizations do these survey-based or interview-based assessments. And what happens is the assessment is out of date the minute you do it. And in many cases, the survey results are not worth what they're printed on because no one really knows the answers. So first, get a tech-enabled assessment. Prioritize. So work through those and figure out, what are my greatest risks? What are those targets I want to go after first? How do I want to create compensating controls for those things I can't do? Be constantly aware of rot. So one of the things that often will happen in an assessment or roadmap, people say, oh, well, we're segmented. Okay, so you have firewalls. No. Yeah, we got firewalls, we're all protected. When you actually get into those and you pull the configurations out of those firewalls, what you find is that they were designed perhaps fine 3 years ago or 4 years ago, but over time, rot happens, meaning rules get put in, changes happen. And the next thing you know, you've got some any at the back end because you needed it for an outage, so that was the easiest way for the vendors to access these systems, and it's still there 2 years later. Any roadmap needs to get some wins early on, and we'll talk about that. And then finally, thinking like an operator. What we mean by that is setting up a roadmap that can walk through, just like you would if you were doing an operational improvement program, a set of targets and objectives, and then essentially manage it just like you would from a program management point of view, an operational program. So what do we typically see as steps in that program? So the first is an assessment step. And again, we lay this out against the NIST cybersecurity framework here. The next is remediation phase. Almost always there's what I'll refer to as a catch-up phase, where there's just a lot of work to be done to clean up the mess that is there from a security point of view. And then there's the maintain phase. So in the assess phase, usually we're establishing the policies, we're starting to gather and analyze perimeter logs if available. We're establishing protection policies, and then we're gathering that real-time inventory. We're gathering that tech-enabled view of what's actually going on in the system, endpoint, network, and all of the components that are in there. And that allows us to build an assessment, which we'll talk about. We move from there then typically to a remediation phase, because we find you get thousands of critical vulnerabilities. You've got tons of users and accounts that shouldn't be there, dormant. They're from some vendor that was there for an outage a couple of years ago. You've got software that someone loaded on the system and no one knew about. And so there's a period of time where we just have to clean up the firewall rules. We have to clean up we have to make sure the backups are working. It may involve doing an initial network segmentation, et cetera. And then there's the maintain phase. And I would say that in many cases, the maintain phase is where we fall down, right? Where organizations fall down. It's critical that once we've done that remediation and we say, great, we made progress, that there's kind of a continuous improvement program across all of the elements. So anyway, these are the high-level pieces of a typical program. I mentioned before, this starts with what we call a technology-enabled assessment. The way we lay this out, and obviously there could be multiple ways, but the first is to align on that framework we've talked about and the objectives to make sure we're all clear when we do the assessment, what we're assessing against, what good looks like. Phase two then is to actually do the technical assessment. What that means in our case is to put software into the system so that we can gather back true endpoint visibility around that system, get back information on all the networking gear, look at vulnerabilities, look at users and accounts, look at backup status, AV status. That technical assessment allows us to get real data for our assessment rather than just interviewing people of what they think the security posture is. And then finally, the third step is to develop that prioritized roadmap. All while we're doing that, we recommend establishing that governance and that processes as we work through the assessment piece, so that by the end, we know how we're going to manage the program and what those processes are going to be. What the technology-enabled assessment allows you to do, it allows you to get what we call a 360-degree view of the risk. So not just, you've interviewed some people and you know that you don't patch frequently. No, you know every vulnerability in the environment. You know every missing patch. You know where devices are securely configured and where they're not against some standard like DSSPIG or CIS. You know all the users and accounts on the system. Those are always a risk. When typically in many of these environments where it's not managed by Active Directory, we find tons and tons of that. Knowing the anti-malware status so that you can actually see, are we up to date with it? I mean, most of the times vendors require their own approved version. So I've got 6 vendors. I got 6 different versions of AV tools. And usually those are the plant responsibility, the updating those. Okay, so how up to date are they on a consistent basis across the board? What are my network protections? As I mentioned before, are those firewall configs really set up like they should? Do we have VLANs? Are they set up like they should be? Backups, asset criticality. That ability to get that real data out allows us to start to put together the right roadmap because we see actual risks, not just what we might get back from an interview or a survey. I'm going to skip a couple of these pages, but the basic gist of these is just to highlight what do you need for that kind of thing, right? You need to get down to the level of all of your manufacturing assets, right? Whether those be PLCs or protective relays or HMIs, et cetera. You need to be able to put an impact category. So how critical is that device to the overall process? You need to be able to put a risk score to it. Take that 360-degree risk view that we talked about and calculate a risk score for each of those assets. Because then you can start to prioritize where are your greatest risks, and you can start to focus from a roadmap point of view of those assets that are most at risk. That tech-enabled assessment allows you to make trade-offs. It's a little fuzzy, but basically the notion here is that you can go through and say, okay, great, there's devices that are equally unpatched, but maybe they're not one isn't as critical as the other. Maybe some have a backup. Maybe some have application whitelisting. And so I can look at compensating controls and make trade-offs to prioritize which ones are most at risk. As I mentioned, users and access control. So being able to pull back information around admin accounts. Inactive accounts, one of the things we find as one of the biggest risks are dormant accounts on these systems that should be cleaned up. Anyway, the point is this tech-enabled assessment allows you to get to a level of depth on all of these elements, these 360-degree view, to set that roadmap. But at the end of the day, that information comes and it starts to enable you to have a very clear view of the risks. And this is against the DHS Defense in Depth framework, at policies, procedures, perimeter, et cetera. But what we often find is these assessments can be so detailed that you lose the forest for the trees. And so coming back to say, okay, what is the overall risk in the environment? Where am I on the biggest risks across the framework? And you could lay this out against NIST or any of the frameworks. Next on the assessment phase is a threat matrix. And so one of the things that we'll find often is that in assessments, if you don't put down what are the real threats, what could actually happen, and really importantly, what's the impact or what's the timing. In this case, this client was most worried about outage timing, right? How long would I be down? If we don't take the vulnerability vectors and tie them back to possible threats, it's kind of theoretical, right? It's like, oh, great, I got a bunch of vulnerabilities, so what? Well, here is the actual things that could happen because of that vulnerability, and the impact, in this case, timing of being down. How long would it take us to recover from such an event? This threat matrix is really only possible if you do have that detailed 360-degree view, because it allows you to see what would happen in the case of a particular kind of threat. That threat matrix then really starts to bring the roadmap into focus, because I see all the threats, the vulnerabilities and risks. I now overlay the threats, and I can start to say, these are the things I most need to worry about. And so eventually that needs to lead to, and this is obviously a very high level version of this, but a prioritized roadmap over time, right? And again, laying it out in this case against the NIST cybersecurity framework, but basically saying, okay, there's some things I got to get done first, and I got to get my policies in place. I got to do my identification phase. Then I can quickly move to doing some things, like maybe I can quickly get application whitelisting done. I can very quickly get timely backups, whether those I have a backup solution or not. Maybe I put a new one in, but I get to having a backup in case of emergency. And then over time, adding additional functionality to the overall program. And obviously you would get much more detailed on this as you work through it. And so that tech-enabled approach really gives 5 benefits, right? It's operationally safe. Number 2, it gives you that risk management much better than if you're just doing surveys. Number 3, it gives you an enterprise visibility, so you get all of those risks in one place. You can accelerate the time to maturity, so you can quickly move from, okay, I see a risk, to, okay, I can quickly fix it because I've got the technology there ready to go to remediate that, to patch it, to harden it. And then over time, it's real time, right? So you get that assessment all the time. So when we get to the monitoring phase, we can see where we are against our targets on a real-time basis. So that's the roadmap. So we've said we now have our assessment. We now know, okay, here's the biggest risks, and here are the set of steps I'm going to take to achieve that risk. And now I need to go assign resources. And so typically what we'll find is that there are some level of priority of different assets or different sites typically. So it may be based on their level of contribution margin. It may be based on criticality to certain customers. It may be based on the contribution that site has to other production. So it's a key input to something. And then to lay out a set of targets against our standard for bronze, silver, gold, right? Because we can't do everything overnight. We're not going to be able to achieve, comprehensive security overnight. So typically, as we start to put that roadmap together and start to assign budgets and resources, we want to budget differently depending on the value, so to speak, of the assets we're talking about. And this is just one way of laying out the kinds of things one would do for a bronze site, right? Okay, we're going to do the basic controls. In silver, we'll add on a set of 20 or so additional controls, and then for silver, we'll go to all of the OT controls we wanted. And then finally, to be able to get down to the real way we have to budget this is we have to go down to specific activities to say, okay, if I'm going to do the remediation, and this is just one page of about a dozen pages of Excel spreadsheets, right? But if I'm going to do remediation and I'm going to start doing patching, how much time is it going to take? How many FTEs am I going to need to do the patching? How many FTEs am I going to need to go and remove software that shouldn't be there? And to get down to an activity by activity basis and make an estimation of how many FTEs I'm going to need to do that. That allows us to build up a budget that actually makes some sense. So often we see organizations spend all their time trying to budget for the software tools, right? Oh, well, I need to buy this tool and that tool and the other tool. So I build up, and no one spends time thinking about how many FTEs is it going to take? How many people am I going to need to manage the process? And so getting down to essentially a task-based level allows us to think about, therefore, we can build a real budget for what we're going to do. When we think about then resourcing this, so okay, so we can set a budget, we can get to activities. Who's going to do it? How are we going to do it? Broadly, there's three choices, right? I can do this as a local task, meaning OT security is really an INC or a plant IT kind of task. Local teams are going to gather their data. Local teams are going to patch. They may work with an OEM to do it at their plant. They're the ones who are going to be doing configuration management. They're the ones, you know, on a regular basis, they'll go through an annual assessment with somebody from the audit team showing up, et cetera. The second option is really more of the global option. So OT security really is an IT task. So I'm going to aggregate all this data into some CMDB tool. I'm going to send an IT team out once a month or once a quarter or once a year to do some sort of manual vulnerability scan, or God forbid, I'm actually going to do a scan from corporate and, you know, not go with PLCs. But, you know, there's going to be an IT-driven approach. I'm going to back up the virtualized stuff, not really going to worry about all the workstations and that because don't really have access into those, etc. There's a third option, is that's what we refer to as this think global, act local. So when we think about resourcing this, we strongly recommend this third option, an option where we can centralize the team to analyze the risks and prioritize any remediations, to then distribute automated playbooks for local execution, where that plant IT team or the INC folks in the plant can then choose when and how to execute those remediation actions. So what does that look like? Pardon me, I got a frog in my throat. So basically the idea is scale up the analytics. So take information from every global site, if you're domestic, you know, all the local domestic facilities, and scale that up into a centralized analysis platform. In many cases, if you're a smaller organization, you might scale that up into an MSSP's scaled automation platform. Then in many organizations, and this isn't necessarily true in every organization, but in many organizations that are global, you may want a regional SME, someone who can be the subject matter expert for security in a region to help out the plants when it comes to the last part, which is acting locally. So when we think global, we can scale this. It drives about 70% efficiency in the overall process. By gathering that data, we can create essentially remediation playbooks centrally, and then those can be distributed down to the plants. But before those actions are taken, and I say plant, I recognize not everybody has plants, but the notion of the person who controls the process can then review those actions. And to take the action, all they have to do is hit go. Rather than, okay, this is your list from ServiceNow of all of these actions you need to take, and you're walking around machine by machine doing the actions. Instead, this is a playbook that can get distributed to automate those, but that's in control of the folks who know the process best. As we think about organizing, we also have to prioritize skills. One of the things that at least I found fascinating when I got into the cybersecurity business 6 or so years ago was that the skills that are needed, the tasks that are needed, so often were mentioned was all the fancy machine learning and anomaly detection and all the rest of that. But when you actually look at the jobs to be done, so to speak, and this is from this CyberSeek database, what you find is that almost 80% of the tasks are related to what might be referred to as systems management. There are things like patch management, configuration management, AV updates, device provisioning, vulnerability analysis, AV and whitelisting management. Not to say that the other stuff isn't important, it is, but when we think about how are we going to go resource the OT security challenge, the focus should be on finding that 80%, finding people who know how to do systems management, or alternatively, training people how to do systems management. Because those are that's the volume, that's where the resources are going to be required. When we all talk about we have a resource constraint, it's there. It's in those 80% of tasks. The good news is that those are not impossible to find. Yes, they're hard, everything's hard. But I'm not looking for a needle in a haystack, right? Now I need to train people on how you do that in OT, right? There may be a lot of people who know it in IT. But again, as we think about resourcing this, focusing on those systems management capabilities. Finally, once we've got the resources, once we've got the budget and we're starting to go, how do we measure, how do we make traction and measure and report? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this page, just given the time here, but we strongly believe the best way to do that is to aggregate this into what we call an OT systems management platform. Ability to bring all of the data on how you're doing into a real-time system to monitor it and track it. If anyone would like to know more, you can go to our website and see more. But we, whether you use ours or somebody else's, we strongly believe we need to bring it all together and not rely on one OEM tool in one place, another OEM tool in another place, or 4 different tools. Get that together. And then as we think about monitoring and maintaining, looking at both the risk reduction, so how am I doing on things like passwords, risky software, dual NICs, at the same time monitoring how I'm doing about a threat response. Do I have canaries deployed so that I can see when ransomware starts? Can I monitor for anomalous file access? And am I seeing and making progress on improving those detections? So the ability to demonstrate and maintain progress against risk and threat. And then, measure. So we ought to be able to know how we doing. Are we red or green? Are we getting closer to the green, or are we closer to the red on the number of vulnerabilities that exist? How about on the number of patches? Looking at this across all of those dimensions that we talked about in the targets, right? So if we take our framework, and our framework says, look, to be mature, we need to get to, the 7%, as I mentioned, of missing assets, less than 7%. Great, okay, that's our bogey. Are we green or are we red? Our target may be to have, less than 1,000 critical vulnerabilities on our systems. Great, are we green or are we red? Being able to do that on a real-time basis. And then measuring it over time. So being able to look back and say, okay, when we started this, we were at the blues, right? This is one of our clients did this, right? So when they started the program, their scores were in blue, the blue bars. And then they evaluated a year later, and their scores were where the gold is. And so those were the improvements over time. So they could actually see, how am I doing, right? One of the big topics is, how do I prove an ROI on security? The way you do it is you set a target that you're trying to achieve, and then you establish a budget for said target, and then you demonstrate success towards that target. And this is a great example of an organization that did just that. So in conclusion, as we think about this, we've talked about those 5 key steps, right? And just to refer one more time back to the 5 key steps: aligning the leadership, establishing those targets, specific targets, know where you want to go, design the roadmap to get you there, assigning resources, particularly those systems management resources, and then find a way to get that data all in one place to measure and monitor it on a real-time basis. So with that, I'm going to turn, and I know we've only got a few minutes for questions. We had some questions come in before, and then it looks like there's a couple in the Q&A. We only got about 5 minutes. One of the questions was, how does the governance for a cybersecurity program look between OT and IT? I'm hoping I kind of addressed a lot of that, but in our view, it's a joint team of people with a clear joint objective. And so the governance becomes much easier when those teams have agreed on the objective originally. Another question was, what is the role of industrial-oriented standards? So IEC 62443 being a perfect example of that. Our belief is that the best approach here is to marry things like NIST cybersecurity framework with the OT-specific stuff like IEC 62443, or alternatively to take a standard like the CIS Top 20 and apply it in an OT context. And we can talk how we've done that in the past. OT is different, and we need to understand that there are policies and processes that have been written specifically for OT. And like IC, right? These guys have spent a lot of time developing OT-specific standards. So our strong view is to use those in combination with some of the more IT standards. Question was around what's the expected time commitment? Look, this is a full-time job. I think the people who say, oh yeah, we're going to have somebody part-time lead our OT cybersecurity effort is just not realistic. The leader of this needs to be a full-time job and probably needs to be a relatively senior person. I won't give a title because it really depends on the organization. But if we're going to spend millions of dollars, which is most cases, what is likely to be required in this for larger organizations, you want a senior leader to do it. The total budgets have been, increasing over time, and so we would expect that to be a full-time commitment from someone. One of the questions was, so there was a question around the IEC 62443. What's your take on automated response? So I guess two thoughts of automated response, right? So our strong view is that the response should have a human in the middle of it before we take an action. The downside risk of being quote unquote wrong are tremendous. And so, and wrong doesn't necessarily mean that you're wrong about the threat. We may have been dead right about the threat. However, the timing of stopping the plant or patching that system or removing that user or whatever, that OT operator may know a lot more than the folks in IT security know, or the tool knows. Now, having said that, there are certainly going to be some detections, some threats where we just have to do it in an automated fashion. So for instance, if we are seeing an explosion of ransomware going across, and it's not a doubt, right? We absolutely want to automate those kinds of things. But our view is in most cases, we will have a human in the middle of doing the response. I think, and the question is, how do we compare to Nozomi or Clarity, or how do we start standing against Nozomi or Clarity? We're just totally different, right? Nozomi and Clarity, from a platform point of view, right? Nozomi and Clarity are a network tool, right? They're monitoring network traffic, and then as a result of that, they will monitor for anomalous patterns in network traffic. The Verve platform is about the endpoint, right? So we're monitoring endpoints, we're looking at risks on endpoints, we're looking at threats on endpoints. But again, this isn't really a discussion around Verve as a platform for today. Happy to have that conversation if helpful. I think Mohammed asked a question. Can you please tell me OT cybersecurity examples, firewall, defining the routing tables? I think Mohammed would love to follow up on that. I'm not sure I can answer. I'm not sure I'm understanding the question, so maybe we can follow up on that afterwards. So look, we're getting to the end here. I appreciate all the questions. Appreciate everyone being here. This will be available by video, and then we are certainly happy to answer any questions afterwards. If folks would like to ping me with an email here, you can see my email on the screen. Be happy to answer any questions that people have. So I hope everybody enjoyed it and have a great rest of your week. And we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar, which will be in October, and you will all be seeing the emails about that. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.